All right, so moving into our afternoon now. It's the hardest time of the day, but one of the most exciting topics definitely can look at. We're here with Ambassador Chavez, who was influential and guided the process of how a declaration is actually adopted at the United Nations. And so we're going to be looking at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was one of, in a way, the first actions of the Human Rights Council at the meeting in 2006 in the summer. It was the second thing, I believe, adopted right after the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. So it's very timely to look at this declaration in the context of the 10th anniversary of the Human Rights Council coming up, but also in the long-term perspective of 70 years of the UN. And definitely Indigenous people's rights is one of the most important issues that can be addressed, and it's also one of the most delicate ones for states to consider. So Ambassador Chavez was very, as you could say, we're from Hawaii, so he navigated the canoe quite well through a lot of very rough waters to be able to make sure that a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples could be reality. And very soon, on September 13th, in a couple of years, we'll be celebrating also its 10th anniversary. So it's a very young declaration, and the ideas of some of the instruments we've talked about. Next year, the twin covenants of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights will be celebrating their big birthdays. But this declaration is new, but it's also very important, and it brings up some of the topics that were being discussed: transnational corporations, state sovereignty, many of the important issues. But we just want to welcome Ambassador Chavez. Also, we haven't seen each other as close. He came to the adoption party in Philadelphia. I remember on a cold evening in December, we were celebrating its initial adoption. And so it's good to see you, and it's fun to always see you in the hallways and remember all the times that we shared in the negotiations. So it's great to see you again. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you very much. I'm, as always, very glad to share with Indigenous peoples some reflections about the history of the Declaration, and I'm very proud of what we all accomplished together. But I think it's important to remember some fundamentals about the Declaration and about the history of the Declaration. So let me first focus on how was the world before the Declaration, how we get to the Declaration, and what can we expect from now. So the Declaration, unlike the world, was not created in 6 days. It took almost 25 years, actually, and that's something people normally is not aware that it took so long. And I must say it took even longer because formally the process for the creation, drafting, and adoption of the Declaration took 20. Well, we started in '83. We ended up in 2007, so it's 24 years. But before the so-called, at that time, subcommission on human rights, and within the subcommission, the working group on indigenous issues, actually began the drafting process. There has been a process to raise awareness on the need of a declaration on the rights of indigenous people. So this has been an extremely long journey for indigenous peoples. From the moment where someone said or started thinking that maybe the current, at the moment, architecture for the protection of human rights within the UN system was not fit for all purposes with respect to indigenous people's rights. So you can imagine that if in 1983 governments asked this subcommission on human rights to start drafting a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, it's because for a number of years before that, there was a concern. The missing element for the protection of indigenous people's rights was already identified during the 70s. It was now it seems evident that indigenous peoples deserve a special protection, and now we have a declaration, we have a ILO Convention 169, we have a special mechanism, a special rapporteur. But in the 70s, there was nothing. And even though in some countries, and I share with you a national experience, when I began my career, indigenous issues were actually under the responsibility of the Department of Environmental Issues. And why so? Because somewhere civil society NGOs decided that rainforest must be protected. And in that process, it was established that within rainforest there were people living in it. So this is how things were 40 years ago. Indigenous peoples were part of rainforest for the international community. Today, indigenous peoples are independent and respected actors of the international system. So I think we, and I say we because I was part of the trip, we all made a significant journey, and you all must be proud of it. So so my first conclusion is that this takes time, and this takes time, and therefore we have to be consistent and coherent, and not to give up, because it is just a matter of time. And experience shows that with perseverance, indigenous peoples have been very, very successful in the recognition and defense of their rights. Now, getting a little bit more into details, what happened at least during the second stage of the process, because there was a first step was the awareness raising process. There was a second stage where governments asked this specialized body, the subcommission on human rights, to draft a declaration on indigenous people's rights. And there was a third moment where governments decided to work together with indigenous peoples on this draft declaration, taking as a basis the draft elaborated by the subcommission. Why the need for this third stage? Because, as I said, a group of experts drafted a text that seemed actually fully acceptable for indigenous peoples back in 1995. Well, simply because despite all efforts, the text in 1995 was not acceptable at all for governments, because governments had a number of concerns with some of the, if not all, the provisions contained in that original draft. So a working group was created, the chairmanship of that group was entrusted to Peruvian colleague and actually kind of mentor, Ambassador Urrutia. Maybe some of you know him, remember him. And then after 4 years, he resigned, and I took over until the completion of the negotiation. What we tried to do was a rather difficult exercise, because on one side we had the indigenous people saying this is a perfect text, we are not ready to accept any change to it. And on the other side, a number of governments requiring, in some cases, rather fundamental amendments to the text, otherwise there will be no declaration. The major difficulty is that the format was completely new and unknown within the United Nations. Never before governments had negotiated with other actors than governments themselves. So that was the specific feature of the process. This is the first time in the history of the United Nations, and maybe history of humankind, where an international text is negotiated together with the persons whose rights are going to be protected through this text. So the potential victims were in the whole. This was a first unique experience so far. So we have to learn how to work under those conditions, how to defeat mistrust, how to know better each other. And the role of the chair was first to build confidence, to make everyone sure that nothing will be adopted without consensus. And that consensus should reflect at the same time the interests of governments, but as I said, the rights and aspirations of indigenous peoples. So how to square the circle? Well, basically time, dialogue, and confidence building process. It was first established that the text as such was not going to be accepted by governments. So I think indigenous peoples made first a major step, not necessarily agreeing, but recognizing that maybe some improvements could be introduced to the text. So we adopted that approach. The text as originally drafted maybe was not perfect and could be improved. And then governments also agreed to, or not to, change things for the sake of changing, but rather to focus on very specific and targeted issues and propose the minimum changes and as only as necessary as to ensure consensus and address some fundamental concerns by governments. What type of concerns governments wanted to address? I could summarize saying that in general governments were extremely concerned about two issues. One is that indigenous people's rights, or the recognition of specific rights for indigenous peoples, will not be construed as a system of rights that may, in one way or another, prevail on the rights of the rest of the population. So the idea is that, or was that, in recognizing the indigenous people's rights, indigenous peoples would be finally respected and integrated to the national societies. And the system of rights will not create a different kind of clash or exclusion. So it was not to create controversy among groups, but rather to integrate indigenous peoples to their societies. And the other set of concerns were related to the idea that indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, may decide to secede from the country. So how to preserve the territorial integrity of countries. I think roughly these were the two major sets of controversies. So, well, little by little, things were decanting and making clear what was really required. And through different formats, through facilitators, for example, first, we managed to, as I said, bring as few changes as possible to the original text to make it more acceptable for governments. But something happened in the road, is that the governments decided to transform the Commission on Human Rights. The Commission was the body that mandated a working group to draft this declaration into the current Council on Human Rights. And that transformation brought a number of changes and forced us to take some decisions on the continuation of the negotiations. In 2006, the text we were negotiating was not ready. Major progress were made at that moment, but also core issues were not totally resolved, at least not by consensus. So that was a crucial moment where we, the working group, indigenous peoples and governments, had to take a difficult decision. What to do with the text, unfinished work. Well, after consultations, I was asked by indigenous peoples and by a large majority of governments to make a proposal, a compromise proposal, that will include all the negotiated texts, but that will also include my views as to where consensus could be met concerning the most sensitive issues like self-determination, like the definition about the definition of who is indigenous and who is not, and some other outstanding aspects. So that's what I did, and then by June 2006, I submitted to the Commission on Human Rights at its last session a compromise proposal. And my recommendation as a chair to the Commission was to adopt that compromise proposal as the declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, because it seemed clear to me that on the most sensitive issue we could have continued discussing for years without reaching an agreement. So it was worth to take a chance and see what happened. And that's what we did. We, unfortunately, as there was no consensus on some outstanding issues, there was a vote, but finally the declaration was adopted by the former Commission on Human Rights and sent to the General Assembly of the United Nations for its consideration. So the process ended here in Geneva in 2006, in June 2006, at the moment of the creation of the Council on Human Rights. So the Council has nothing to do with the declaration. And I must say that the Council has not inherited, and that's unfortunate, of the ability of the former Commission on Human Rights to set standards in the field of human rights. So Joshua remembered that the declaration was adopted together with the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. 10 years after its creation, the current Council has not produced any new standards in the field of human rights. And that's, I don't know if that's what actually victims expect from the Council. UPR exercise is interesting. That's something new with respect to the former Commission. But I think in that way, in that transition, we lost the standard setting ability. Nothing new has been produced by the Council. But having said that, as I said, the declaration was adopted by the Commission and sent to the General Assembly. And then in New York, we had a text technically adopted by the governments, the members of the Council, but still the text had to undergo discussion and scrutiny in the General Assembly with universal membership. You must recall that the Council has had, just as the Commission, has as just the Council a restricted membership. So that's the reason why a declaration of the United Nations has to be adopted by the General Assembly. And then at the General Assembly level, the same concerns were raised again by a number of states. What about territorial integrity? What about self-determination? What about some specific rights? Well, there was no format for negotiations in the General Assembly. So during 1 year, I continued consultations in New York, but this time without the participation of indigenous people, which was a kind of weird thing, because we were all used to have around the table indigenous peoples themselves speaking for themselves. But ultimately, some indigenous peoples were in the halls, and we managed to convince them to accept some additional, call them improvements to the text adopted by the Commission to make it viable at the General Assembly. And in particular, we had to modify Articles 44, 45 in reference to territorial integrity, basically. But with those changes, the The declaration was presented for adoption at the GA in September 2007. I had the honor actually to introduce the resolution in New York, and it was adopted with only 4 votes against. And what proves that we were right in the approach, that not to seek indefinitely for consensus, is that those 4 countries who eventually voted against the declaration in 2007 later decided to withdraw their reservations and to join consensus around the declaration. So it is true that the declaration is not legally binding and that it was voted, but it is also true that since then, now all the international community has rallied around the text of the declaration. And no one has reservations on its content. So I think this is an important element to be taken into account, but because we all know that this is not legally binding, but yet we must know that though it was voted today, it constitutes a consensus document. And therefore, it serves as a guide for what I always call a new relationship between states, national societies, and indigenous people. So, in completing the process of negotiation and adoption of the declaration, we launched a new process. And this process is where we are now. Now, how to make operational those rights enshrined and contained in the declaration. This is not an easy task either, because the declaration is aspirational, and because the declaration is one-size-fits-all document. So it has to be adapted to every national and specific situation. And this adaptation constitutes in itself how I put it, a learning process. And now, if I take a national experience in Peru, well, we now have legislation to implement consultation with indigenous peoples, which is unique. Well, indigenous peoples are not really happy about the way consultations take place. But it is also true that we are the only country where there is a law, a specific law to conduct consultation. So we are learning to learn each other. It takes time. It will take time. What is important is, as I said in the beginning, and I will conclude with this, is to be aware that these things take time. Nothing changes from one day to another. Indigenous peoples have to continue persevering as they have persevered for so many years. Be sure that governments in general want the welfare of all their citizens, and indigenous peoples are also citizens. They have rights, and they also benefit from the commitment of governments wishing to comply in good faith with the provisions contained in the declaration. But in practical terms, it may not be as easy as it seems. Don't lose faith, because your faith brought you up to here. And now, if there are comments or questions, I'd be more than glad to respond to. Thank you.
We'll have the first comment then, next door, and then we can also get into the provocative stuff too. If you want to.
Thank you, Ambassador Chavez. It's very interesting lesson another day about indigenous people. In Laos, you have known about the history of Laos too. We are a country with diverse ethnic group of people. Before 1975, the official survey indicating Laos have 68 ethnic groups living side by side in the country. Our way of life is somewhat different. Those who are living in the high mountain, we call the high mountain people, in the low level and in the flat plain. And those who live in the flat plain has been settled in that part of the world for many years, except the indigenous, they come in from China, migrate from southern of China and living in the high dense mountain jungle. History teach us and allow us to live with harmony and peace together until late 21st century and during the conflict of Indochina. Those indigenous people, they are mostly living by cutting down the tree, the forest, the jungle to raise the crop, to feed themselves, and they migrate from year to year. I think similar to what the indigenous people in Peru. Right? Unfortunately, those people during the Cold War were recruited by the CIA. They are very good, hardworking people. And this particular group called the Hmong, or the Mel, that we call them. After the war, this group of people were punished by the current government, Lao PDR. Also, the other group that served and lived inside Laos, they were also persecuted in the sense that lately the survey come out, it shows that from 1975, Laos PDR has 68 ethnic groups. Currently, Laos only have 49 ethnic groups left. In a nutshell, we can say that under the Declaration of Human Rights and Indigenous Protection, Lao government, according to the Lao government, they are doing so good that they can eliminate the ethnic group from 68 ethnic group down to 49. Ladies and gentlemen, if you know how to add up the math, it means that almost 50% of the ethnic Lao, indigenous in Lao, has been disappeared. There's one way or another. The clear reason of this disappearing is forced replacement. Some of them consider to be the enemy. They are living in the jungle. They consider to be the insurgent against the Lao PDR. They don't get along. Lao PDR authority use brute force, intolerance, killing. Most of them, they try to kill these people, they will disappear. This is a very sad story. In your condition, this is different. In the sense that indigenous people in Peru, in South America, and the government and the people, national people, try to work together. At least this conversation starting there, moving forward. That is the progress for what I see. I agree with you that it takes time from the indigenous people and also the national people to understand each other. To build trust, it takes time, and I agree wholly agree with that. But in the Lao case, you have to go back to the human right abuse and violation. These poor people, they don't have anybody to stand up for them. They just become the victim of Lao PDR. The authority still consider them as the enemy, and they try to get rid of these people. Some of the ethnic, the Lao PDR use them as a victim of the economy reason. They use that it designate live in a particular area, so the tourists, the foreigner tourists can go in Laos and visit and spend money, and therefore it is systematic run by the government, and the government benefit from that. Instead, the income, the generate income that the Lao, the government get, instead of the money go to the people. Instead of doing that, they don't benefit from that. They just live with that, just like a show, an animal. It's inhuman. It's inhuman, and create a lot of declination of the culture, and also some of the escape from the camp, from the designated area, and integrate themselves into the majority, the mainstream, and they don't want to show up that they are the indigenous people because of the fear and the discrimination against them. That's the story that I like to share in the exchange with you in comparison to Peru and the do for the indigenous people. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? We can also then focus in conclusion and looking at maybe the future or some ideas or a future direction regarding the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous, if you want to.
Thank you. Well, as far as the future is concerned, who knows the future? Let's look at the present. The present is that indigenous peoples actually benefit from a legal framework. That was not the case years ago. But in addition to the legal framework, there is also a structure for monitoring these rights. Today, we have at the UN level at least 3 different mechanisms for monitoring indigenous people's rights respect. One is the Special Rapporteur on indigenous people's rights. Currently, this is Vicky Taulikopoulos. You know her. She's a long-standing champion of indigenous people's rights. Then you have within the Council on Human Rights the expert mechanism on indigenous people's rights, or EMRI. And this expert mechanism brings together one expert from indigenous origin, representing the different geographical regions of the world, bring together and discuss about the situation in this area and propose new ways to further improve the rights of indigenous people and the situation of indigenous people. And then you have at the Economic and Social Council level the Permanent Forum on Indigenous People, which is also a forum integrated by experts. Some of those experts are actually appointed by the government, but half its members are actually appointed by indigenous peoples themselves. So it's also a unique architecture within the United Nations. This is the only forum where indigenous peoples and governmental experts can have a dialogue. So it is a process a bottom-up process in cases like Peru. Now the governments and indigenous peoples are learning to know each other. So it is bottom up, and but at the UN level we have the process upside down. So it is from the top where directions are given to states as to how to behave with respect to their indigenous peoples. Now, this is what we have, and we have to make it work. I know that some indigenous peoples insisting having more mechanisms, additional mechanisms to monitor. Others want additional legal framework. You will know that for some indigenous peoples, the declaration is not enough because it is not legally binding, and therefore they are asking for a treaty or a convention that enshrines some legally binding obligations for states. Honestly, I think before running, we must learn to walk. And it is crucial to go to the maximum extent, to the limits of the current instruments we have in front of us. And we have different instruments. We have a declaration, which is the legal framework, and we have 3 mechanisms to monitor this legal framework. And by far, we have not nailed yet the limits of any of these 3 mechanisms. But this is my personal opinion, and you can perfectly argue that I'm still a governmental representative. But this is how I personally feel. And based on the experience of the declaration, because it takes time, and this confidence building process is a very delicate one, and it can work both ways. If you don't carry out the confidence building process in a proper manner, then you will have a lot of mistrust. So I think we should give a chance to what we have to work and see then what's next. But for now, we did not reach the limits of what we have so far. This is my personal opinion.
All right. We have a question then in the front. Yeah.
Yes, just a question from us. We just want to add on to Mr. Van Lang there on the right side in regards to the 68 ethnic group that decreased to 29 ethnic group. We want to add on that in Laos, the Laotian people are becoming minority, excuse me, in their own land and or the country, and then taken over by Vietnam and China. We want to know how do we resolve those kind of problems.
It's a very poignant question in a sense where I guess it would be settler societies which indigenous peoples have had to deal with, and it's also part to consider. And this is in a way a new wave in the sense that it's not the European coming in of France establishing Indochine, but a closer neighbor without what we used to call the blue law and the separation in that sense. So it's a modern twist on some of those issues, if that's okay to try to begin to look at that.
Thank you. Well, one of the major difficulties we had to face in the process of the negotiation was to determine the scope of the future declaration. That means who was going to benefit from the rights contained recognized in the declaration. And there were a number of situations, and it was impossible, it has proven to be impossible to agree on a unique definition about what constitutes indigenous peoples. So basically studies were made, but based on the reality in the Americas and or former European colonies. But in the case of Asia in particular, and Africa, well, governments said, and I think they had a point, that in one specific country, everyone was indigenous. The government was indigenous, and everyone, they were all indigenous. So how to grant special rights to a group of people within a nation where everyone could easily claim the same nature. So that's then what was the solution to that? Well, let's try to work on a good faith basis, and then let's agree that we will live with the declaration without a definition establishing who's indigenous and who's not. And therefore it will be up to every government, based on its concrete experience and situation, to define who's going to be protected by this declaration and who's not. This is not the case of Convention 169 of ILO. Convention 169 of ILO contains a definition. And in my opinion, as a result of such a definition, only 22 countries in the world have ratified Convention 169. Because for the majority of the countries in the world, the existence of such a restrictive definition makes it unapplicable for them. And we're stuck there. 22 members, and that's it. Mostly from the Americas. So it's clear that 169 does not fit the needs from Africa or Asia. That's what the declaration is aimed at, to fill that gap. And to fill that gap, we had to avoid the definition. And so that maybe brings some problems in terms of implementation. But again, the system does have mechanisms to monitor. So whomever feels actually suffering some prejudice, we have the special rapporteur, we have the permanent front, we have Emery, to look and to assess these situations, and through those mechanisms, indigenous peoples can actually engage into a better dialogue with their governments. That's actually what the system is being crafted for. Not only with respect to indigenous people's rights, to any right. If anyone feels that their rights are not respected, well, that person or group of persons can contact the mechanisms of the Council on Human Rights to present their claims and to request those mechanisms to convey their claims to the concerned governments. And this is how also dialogue begins. Sometimes governments need some guidance, need some help It's not a matter only of bad faith. Sometimes they don't know, or they are confused. And special mechanisms are there to set the standard and to ensure that the spirit of the declaration is respected worldwide on the same footing. So don't hesitate to knock at the door of special mechanisms. They are here to help.
I think that's a perfect way to end. And also very consistent with some of the other panels talking about the role of the special procedures and how people must be persistent but patient, but also put their passion and professionalism behind and to try to ensure that there are results. So I'd like to thank Ambassador Chavez for coming and spending the afternoon. And